So to recap, as I said on day one, veterans don't want to be seen as victims, and they don't want to be seen as heroes. So what else is there? Uh-oh, that's unfortunate, isn't it? If we're talking of a world with heroes and victims, in the only third role that can be taken that's of any significance is villains, and I very much expect that veterans don't want to be seen as villains either. Well, a world that just has those three characters in is a storytelling world that we call melodrama. Let's have a look at melodrama and what exactly is the difference between a hero, a victim and a villain. So, hello. So this is melodrama. We have a victim here, we have a hero who is really out to save victims, that's their main job, and we have a villain who's here to antagonise the hero and antagonise the victim, so the hero's got somebody to rescue. Right? Yeah, that's how melodrama works. Now, I've put a couple of axes on here. I've put 3 axes actually, just to confuse things. Normally used to 2 axes. This has 3 axes. Don't worry about it. I haven't labelled them yet. I'm going to label them now. So firstly, your hero and your victim, they're both virtuous. And your villain, he's evil or corrupt. It's called corrupt, shall we? Corrupt. Your villain is also infamous. He has infamy. They've all got it, infamy. That's a joke from Carry On Cleopatra. Oh, Carry On Cleo, actually. I think it's Carry On Cleo. Anyway, and he has glory. The reason he has glory and the victim doesn't is because virtue is pretty easy for the victim because the victim's helpless. However, for the hero, virtue is a struggle because he has agency, and so does the villain. In that sense, the hero and the villain have I'm nicking this from Alison Tierman actually, by the way, so I should put credit where credit's due. The hero and villain have more in common than they do with the victim, because they both have agency and the victim doesn't. Now, melodrama was a theatrical form or dramatic form that was popularised in the 19th century. There is an older one that actually probably more closely resembles what human experience actually is like. Older. It's interesting, isn't it, that normally you expect things to get better, not to get worse. The older form that actually probably resembles something better than this 3-part situation where we have heroes, villains and victims is tragedy. It uses Aristotelian tragic form. The tragic hero has elements of both of all 3 characters. He has elements of villainy, he has elements of heroism, and he has elements of victimhood. Just to be quite clear, he is virtuous, but he's not eminently good. He has flaws. In fact, he's got a tragic flaw. This tragic flaw is going to lead to an error of judgment. An error of judgment in which he'll suffer far more than he deserves. He'll suffer far more than he deserves, but from that he gains wisdom. Now, the reason Aristotle was keen that the main protagonist of a tragedy should be both virtuous and have tragic flaws was because then he'd be not eminently good, He'd be somebody that we could all relate to. And so when we have the combination of the fact that he's somebody just like us, with elements of virtue but also some tragic flaws, that when he suffers more than he deserves, we think, oh my God, that could be me. And that way we are aroused both pity and fear when we witness the tragedy. So why does advocacy work not use the tragedian model of drama and instead prefer the melodramatic model? Well, because there is one character always missing from the story in a piece of advocacy, and that's the hero. Because that's who they want you to be, right? That's why you're going to reach into your pockets, or that's why you're going to volunteer, or why you're going to raise awareness, because the hero's missing, and that means the hero's got to be you. But it's nonsense. I mean, this leaves a world in which there are only villains and victims, and no one really wants to be seen as a victim. But if the choice is between being seen as a victim or being seen as a villain, well, then you might want to be seen as a victim. So I say let's go back to this model. Now when it comes to veterans, we've got to ask ourselves, why do they join the military? That's certainly what I was asking myself towards the end of the last day that I filmed, was if all these things that raise your chances of committing suicide are also associated with joining the military, that there's all these suicide risks associated with the military, why would anyone want to join? I suppose if you thought that they were heroes, you'd think that it was to protect and serve their country. And if you thought they were victims, you'd probably think that it was because they had no choice. In the old days, because they were conscripted. Nowadays, because economic situations made it that was the only option they had. There is some truth in that. Those who join the military tend to come from a lower socio-economic statuses. It's the only secure correlation there is low socio-economic status. There's not even a strong correlation with being a native born or being an immigrant. In fact, immigrants are proportionally represented in the military. The ethnic groups are more or less proportionally represented in the military. Certainly blacks and whites are proportionally represented. Hispanics and Asians are slightly underrepresented, but not significantly. There's not significantly disproportional representation of the ethnicities in the military, but there is a disproportionate representation of those who are in the lower economic groups. If you thought that they were a villain, you'd think that they'd be going into the military because it'd make them feel powerful and it'd give them a chance to kill people. Actually, the most common reasons stated are: I wanted to see the world, my life was boring, I didn't want to be stuck behind a desk, I wanted to be able to pay my way through college, all of these don't particularly belong to any of these groups, right? They're not the motivations that you associate with a victim. Like, I had no choice. There was no other way out for me. They're not the motivations you associate with a hero. They're not about wanting to serve their country and all that sort of thing. And they're not the motivations you associate with the villain, which be, I want to kill! I want to kill! I want to maim! None of that. It's something very much in the middle. Something that is reasons that are virtuous, but not eminently good. So why was the perfect dramatic form replaced in the 19th century by an inferior dramatic form, I hear you ask? I said, I hear you ask. Thank you. I'm glad you asked me that. It's a very astute question. Of course, the 19th century was a time of imperial expansion, and this kind of model is perfect for propaganda, because if you can identify a victim that the villain is antagonizing, then you can also offer people the role of being hero if they enlist to fight said villain. This needn't even be on a global scale. In fact, in many ways, the Nazi propaganda and KKK propaganda were exactly the same. I mean, the villains were in their propaganda. The use of the melodrama model in war propaganda is not as fashionable as once it was. The Vietnam War made people less comfortable with the idea of the military as heroes, especially when the wars we're fighting at the moment are at best morally ambiguous. But you've got to give them a special status somehow, right? You can give them some incentive to join, otherwise you're going to have struggle to join, especially now you can't just conscript soldiers anymore. They've all got to be volunteers. How do you get them to volunteer? Well, of course, to a certain extent there is see the world and learn a skill, and there is of course something else, and to explain that something else and why it might be rather attractive to be a victim after all, we've got to talk about another Victorian idea. It doesn't originate the Victorians really, it goes back to the Elizabethans, it goes back really to the beginning of the Poor Laws, but as it is very closely associated with Victorian society, and has sort of reared its ugly head again, is the dichotomy between there being deserving poor and undeserving poor. And if you do make your veterans out to be victims, then you can continue villainising the undeserving poor as scroungers, but give provision to veterans. Whereas if we were to use the tragic hero model, remember the thing about the tragic hero model is, oh my god, there's somebody just like me that's had an unfortunate experience, then for that could happen to me, that could. It could well happen to you. A lot of the things that happen to veterans do happen to a lot of civilians, in terms of homelessness, in terms of mental health issues, in terms of divorce, in terms of joblessness. I'll read you this article. I'm not going to read the whole article to you because it's long. It's from a page called Talk Poverty, Leave No Civilian Behind. Roughly 1.4 million veterans live in poverty in the United States, and in total more than 45 million people live at or below the poverty line. These numbers are similarly unacceptable. Yet the conversation around military poverty and civilian poverty couldn't be more different. Common rhetoric around military poverty often follows this formula. Active members of the military and veterans should not experience poverty because they served our country and made enormous sacrifices. That's not why they joined up. I've just talked about that. They didn't join up because they wanted to serve the country. They joined up because they didn't want to be bored, they didn't want to be stuck behind a desk, they wanted to get a college degree. Bear in mind here that if we're talking about them being victims and talking about the idea that they joined because they had no choice. If they joined because they had no choice, they joined because they had no choice because of poverty. So you're kind of shutting the door after the horse has bolted. You know, they've already gone off and done their tour. They've already signed up and done their tour of duty. And now you're going to deal with their poverty? Now you've fucked them up in the head? Great. Great. Again, as I said, that motivation, the motivation of, well, they had to go, they had to join, they had no other choice, there was no better options for them. That's part of the victim narrative. But I'm just saying, if you are employing the victim narrative, then that's the story, right? That they joined up because they were poor. So why didn't you deal with the poverty first? Why didn't you deal with the poverty before they had to join up? Joblessness and homelessness, these are society-wide issues. You should deal with it society-wide. It's not picking out a special group that we're going to say now they deserve our help. If you'd helped in the first place, then you wouldn't have the situation where they were the first during the military. Now, of course, you wouldn't have any cannon fodder, would you? Hey. Now, there may be some provisions that veterans particularly need. Provision to certain healthcare. But there are other policies that are made that have restricted civilian access to programs that could have helped everyone. Ending homelessness is both a moral and economic imperative. Research demonstrates that allowing homelessness to persist is more expensive for localities than housing people in many cases. But acknowledging this reality and responding with targeted policy reforms, cities like New York and Washington DC have seen dramatic decreases in the numbers of chronically homeless single veterans. And much of this movement has been propelled by the success of housing first strategies, which house homeless individuals quickly and provides them with wraparound services such as education, substance abuse counselling and other social services needed. As a result, the number of homeless veterans has declined by 12% from 2012 to 2013. However, in these cities, the number of homeless people in families increased during that same period. Dramatic decreases in veteran homelessness in major cities may have occurred because limited financial resources have been shifted to target specific groups rather than expanding investments to be more inclusive. So while the progress made on veteran homelessness is important, the strategy that has been embraced by some of these cities to achieve this goal is unsustainable. It perpetuates a system where vulnerable homeless populations are forced to compete over limited resources. The efforts to house homeless veterans prove that public policy and investments in housing can end homelessness. Policymakers shift their thinking and make a financial commitment to ending homelessness for all people. I hashtagged yesterday about all homelessness matters. I want to get that across. Yes, veterans have an increased, elevated risk of homelessness, but there's still homeless people. Let's not just deal with veteran homelessness. Let's deal with all homelessness. The inference is that avoiding hunger and poverty is something you need to earn, and you can therefore continue to say that that civilians living in poverty deserve to live in poverty. So there's a divide and conquer approach to making veterans out to be victims, because it means that you can leave the undeserving poor to struggle. whilst giving benefits to the deserving poor. And that's the thing with, of course, the tragic hero model is, remember, the tragic hero he's just like us. He's just like you and me. He's not a hero, and he's... I got him the wrong way. He's not a hero, and he's not a villain, and he's not a victim. He's like you and me, deserving of empathy just as much as you and I are, right? Yeah, so so I'm going to do 22 push-ups for the sake of my health. I'm no hero. I'm going to do 22 push-ups for the sake of my health, for reasons that are virtuous but not eminently good. And I'm going to be promoting calm. Here we go again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. Alright, so before I go, I think there's probably something I need to clear up, because I'm using the hashtag there, all suicides matter, and then I'm advocating for calm. Calm is the Campaign Against Living Miserably. It's a campaign dealing with the issue of male suicide. And if all suicides matter, why am I dealing specifically with males? Aren't I making men out to be now a special case when I just complained about making veterans a special case? And that's a very good question, and I'm glad you asked me it. Look, as I say, advocacy groups, because they are sort of propaganda in their way, because they're trying to raise money. When they use this model, there are certain advocacy groups that very specifically make out this group here to be women, which means that men are left in one of these two groups, as they traditionally always have been, as they always were in Melodrama, which means that men are one of these two groups here. And the thing is, we know full well that we're not here. None of us are perfect, and that only leaves one. This one here. Now, I think perhaps if we could get back to a view of the world that's a bit more like the fact that all of us are like this, then perhaps that in itself might reduce male suicide. Which is ironic when you think about it. When you think about how tragedies end. That was the whole point of tragedy. It was catharsis. Catharsis, so you get it out of the system.